and welcome to today's Cybersecurity Summit Power Hour. My name is Rick. I'll be in the background answering any WebEx technical questions. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties joining the WebEx session, please submit a question using the Q&A panel. During the presentation, all participants will remain in listen-only mode, and as a reminder, this event is being recorded for rebroadcast. We'll be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of each of today's presentations. We encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send. Please keep the dropdown as all panelists. With that, we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Bradford Rand, CEO of the Cybersecurity Summit. Bradford, you have the floor.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We are excited. This is one of our final power hours for this region, the Southwest region. But everyone is invited to join us July 28th. We are doing a full day cybersecurity summit with speakers from the Secret Service, the FBI, DHS, and great companies such as Darktrace, and Cisco, and many others. We are going to kick off today's Power Hour with the FBI once again. If you stay with us the entire hour and a half, you'll be getting a CPE completion certificate in approximately 2 to 3 days. And also, we always get asked, will the slides be shared? And that answer is positively yes. So in about 2 days, we'll upload all of the slides to cybersummitusa.com. And last but not least, as Rick said, if you've got any questions, throw them in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And without further delay, let's bring on Sharon Howard. He's been speaking for us for the last few years at our Cyber Summits. Sharon, can you hear us? Bye-bye. All right, we're going to bring up our next speaker. Rick, let's get up the next slide. We've got our in-house expert from IBM Security. Michael, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Bradford?
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see you overdressed, as we discussed before. That's great.
Especially since I'm in Austin, Texas. It's definitely overdressed.
Terrific. Well, stay safe out there, and we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Awesome. So yeah, I want to talk about identity and access management and how we can leverage that as a key pillar of zero trust. And some of this is, talking about the worlds of fraud and identity coming together. So I think it should be an interesting topic for us. When we look at the zero trust frameworks that are out there, Forrester launched the concept of zero trust many years ago, and Gartner came out with Carta, which is a useful construct, as well as Google with their Beyond Corp. They're all useful frameworks to think about where we are in our security practice and what we're doing to address the kinds of risks that exist out there today when we have so many different users wanting access to so much information. We're in this digital transformation world, and COVID even accelerated that when you think about all the remote work that's going on with the workforce. And really, some of the principles are around enforcing, informed policies to protect data. So you need to have a way to build out a policy around your data and which identities can access that information, or what challenges we want to put in front of those users to verify that they are in fact who they say they are, because we're not trusting anyone. We're not trusting our customers because we don't know anything about them, and even our workforce, credentials can be breached, and accounts can be taken over. So we need a way to have some policies on how we're going to protect the data and when we're going to check that people are who they say they are. And part of this construct is really that since we're never trusting anybody, we're going to authenticate every action. That doesn't have to mean that we ask people for their passwords every time they try to do anything, or that we challenge them with an MFA every time. We want to talk about how we can use a risk-based authentication approach to authenticate people every time, but sometimes we can do that in the background silently without them even being aware of that. The other concept, which Carta, I think, drives home is continuous authentication. So authentication is not a one-time thing that happens when people provide their credentials or when they overcome an MFA challenge. We always need to look at the risk of what's happening with the data that's being accessed and continuously assess that risk and authenticate whenever appropriate. So when you think about, fighting fraud in the world of consumers, there's a set of attributes that you can look at and leverage. And our point of view is that the worlds of fraud mitigation and identity are really coming together, and we can use some of the context that's available to us as we look for fraud in our organization, and we can leverage that same context for to build out a risk profile of what's being done and adaptively respond to the access requests, or adaptive access for short. So you start at the top of this wheel and you think about what do we know about the account? If it's an employee, what's that employee entitled to access? Are we using the principle of least privilege to enforce that they don't have an overly broad attack surface area if their account gets compromised? So knowing what the user is supposed to access and not supposed to access becomes a key point. If it's a consumer, we can understand if this is a new consumer, are they applying for multiple loans across the internet? Are they coming in from a bad known IP address? And what do we know about that consumer? Is it a new customer, or somebody that's already been establishing some trust with us through multiple interactions? The device itself gives us a lot of telemetry that we can leverage. If that device is a laptop, of course, we can understand where that laptop is. Is that laptop registered? If it's an employee, is the laptop under management, or is it an unmanaged device? From a phone perspective, if it's a mobile or a tablet, we can understand, again, whether that is registered, whether that is the same device that people have used in the past, or whether it's new. And potentially we can understand if that device is jailbroken, rooted, or has any malware on it. So that becomes an interesting source for context for us. From an activity standpoint, this is about looking at the risk associated with what the user is doing. So, in a consumer situation, are they doing the normal patterns for what users do? Are they looking at their account balance? Are they paying a bill? Are they, conforming to normal known patterns across all users? Or are they doing something that's actually a pattern associated with a fraudulent activity, potentially setting up a new account and transferring a large sum of money? Based on what that user is doing, in conjunction with these other contexts, help us understand the risk associated with their activity. The environment's really where the user is coming in from. Is it a known geolocation that they normally come in from? Did they move from one geolocation to another geolocation, like too fast? The velocity is unreasonable. Is it coming in from Russia or other bad areas that tend to be higher risk? So understanding the network environment is really important. And the last one that's very interesting, I think, is around behavioral biometrics. So as opposed to the user's activity, where you compare a user against a population, with behavioral biometrics, you're actually comparing that user's behavior against their normal baseline. So we know how users interact with our services. We know their keystroke velocity. We understand how they move their mouse. We understand if it's a phone, literally where they hold the phone. And so there's a lot of data that's available to us to understand if this user is really who they say they are, or if maybe their account was taken over and somebody else is acting on their behalf. So the moral of this story is that there's no silver bullet when it comes to context. The more context you have, the better job you can do of building out an intelligent view of the risk associated with the user's activity, and then responding with either allowing access, blocking access, or challenging access based on what your policy is. What this looks like, we call it adaptive access, also called risk-based authentication. You need a way to have your administrator on the right side here set up a policy. We're trying to, in this case, we're trying to balance security and convenience. It's a zero trust environment, but that doesn't need to mean that it can't provide a convenient experience for the end user. So if there's a low amount of risk associated with this given interaction, such as it's a known user coming in from their known device, they're doing low risk activity, let's just let them in. Let's not even make them provide their credentials, because we know who they say they are. They are who they say they are. In a medium or high risk situation, our risk score based on all this context is indicating that something's amiss, one of those factors is driving a higher risk score. And then we can, as an administrator, choose to whether I want to authenticate them with MFA once they start the session, or continuously assess their activity throughout the session and always step up with an authentication when the risk score is high. We can also do things like use the identity and access management system as the mitigation system for this activity, and we can block access, right? So if risk score is very high, we'll just go ahead and deny access altogether. So a simple policy engine lets someone who's not an identity expert or a fraud expert, for that matter, assign an action to each risk level for all the connected applications and services. So that's what it looks like kind of from an administrative perspective, but I thought it'd be useful to walk through from an end user perspective how these different interactions can look if we're doing a good job of, zero trust, risk-based authentication. So we have a user Francine. We have some personally identifiable information about her, such as her name and her email and her telephone number and where she lives. And we also have built up a behavioral profile of her. We understand, her biometrics, like her fingerprint, how she typically moves the mouse, how fast she types, and what devices she typically accesses services from, and what country she's in. So we have a baseline of information about Francine. So in a standard situation where the real Francine matches up very well with how we've analyzed her identity based on all those contexts, she's moving her mouse the normal way, typing speed's great, same device, same location, everything looks great. We're going to just provide her with a very seamless experience here, a passwordless experience where we let her in and let her have access to the resources that she needs. So again, this is frictionless for her. She was authenticated behind the scenes based on the information we have. We were able to provide her a very great user experience, and we didn't make her jump through any hoops. Let's say Francine goes on a trip and she's now in the UK, and a reasonable amount of time to allow her to travel from San Francisco to the UK has elapsed. So the only things that are amiss are her login geography, her MAC address, and perhaps the device that she's logging in from. So this represents a level of risk, and our policy can decide what we want to do with that. Maybe it's a typical thing for our workforce or our consumers to do this type of travel. So we'll just ask them for their single sign-on password at this point in time to make sure that they are who they say they are. Let's take another situation where we've analyzed Francine's identity and we see that she provided the right credentials, the right username and password. She's coming in from the right geography, but the behavioral biometrics are all over the place, right? Her mouse, the typing speed, the way she's using her device, the things she's trying to do are amiss. This could be a situation where Francine's in the office, if she's working in the office, and she steps away from her machine and somebody comes in and is trying to do something malicious. Or it could be that her account was compromised and it's a completely a different bad actor externally. So this is obviously an insider threat situation, and the policy might say, we're going to do an MFA, we're going to send a one-time password to her registered device and make her confirm that she is doing those things and she is who she says she is. And then finally, in the kind of the more extreme situation, we have a situation where the biometrics are bad. In other words, the way perhaps she's cutting and pasting her credentials into the UI, or her mouse speed has a remote access Trojan in place, and she's coming in from Moscow. Again, in this case, it's very high risk, looks like a malicious login. We can go ahead and deny access. The way you externalize denying access doesn't have to mean, hey, we caught you, you're a fraudster. You can just make, essentially most of our customers just put up an innocuous screen saying, that service not available at this time. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how risk-based authentication can work in the real world. The way we manifest these capabilities is through our IBM Security Verify solution. And this isn't meant to be a product pitch. It's meant to say, here's how you can think about your identity and access management capabilities. Really, the goal is allowing people, APIs, and things to have access to the resources that they need to do their jobs or to consume services, irregardless of where those resources exist. So people, we often think of identity as people, but increasingly, of course, there's different kinds of people. They may be consumers, they may be the workforce, they may be privileged users, so they all have different requirements. Increasingly, though, it's really about APIs and things that are needing access to resources. And your identity platform should be comprehensive in terms of not just being access management or authentication and authorization, but include intelligent governance capabilities as well, which allows you to understand more about what that user is supposed to have access to, what they're entitled to have access to, so that that can be taken into account. Proactive threat mitigation really means, are you taking your identity information and integrating it into your SOC? Are you able to take the telemetry of the identity and take the information around what the identity is doing and feed that up to your SOC analyst, open up cases for investigation and orchestrate responses? And from our standpoint, we really leverage three fairly unique capabilities to provide all that. Adaptive access is what we've been talking about. We also specialize in identity analytics to add value on top of your existing identity platform and help you make better decisions. And then we really believe decentralized identity is the wave of the future. And years from now, our digital identities will be managed in a completely new way. So we've got a lot going on that front as well. Wanted to kind of leave you with a way of thinking about where you exist today on your roadmap to zero trust. Some of you have conscious projects where you're trying to accomplish zero trust. Others understand the concept vaguely and are doing a lot of the right things. This is not meant to say that users or identity are the only way to establish zero trust. We understand from IBM that zero trust is a concept that goes beyond users to include data, apps, the device, and the network itself. We just feel as though it's a logical starting point because identities are kind of at the center of the universe here. So if you think about a maturity curve, where are you at in terms of defining this context? How much of that context that I showed can you accomplish today? And then when you have that, what are you doing in terms of verification and enforcement? So are you using SSO, or do you have MFA enabled? Do you have privileged access management enabled for your privileged users? And so on down the list. And finally, how good of a job are you doing in terms of helping to resolve incidents that are found through this context in terms of, taking action like quarantining IDs and dynamically blocking access to applications? So that's more about the telemetry and how integrated you are into your overall SOC operations. Just want to leave you with a couple of resources. We just recently were featured as a leader in the Forrester Wave on risk-based authentication, and it's really due to the strong adaptive access capabilities that we have. we leveraged the fraud engine that we have for years and years in the banking industry and brought that into our identity solution to create adaptive access. So you can learn more about that here. Our services people work with a variety of vendors to help you with your zero trust journey. We have an acceleration service. So don't think of our services folks as only being able to help you if you have IBM products. If you have, several different fraud and or identity providers, they're very good at helping you accelerate your journey. And finally, if you want to just see adaptive access in action, it's very easy to sign up for our trial. It lets you run adaptive access free of charge for up to 5 apps for an unlimited amount of time. So that's what I had. We'll open it up for any questions.
Hey, Michael. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience here. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
All right. How do you know where someone is logging in from? In some cases, the IP address works if the address is registered to a country. There are plenty of IP addresses that are registered to organizations and can be anywhere in the world. GPS coordinates? Question mark.
Yeah. So we have we have a fraud consortium cloud that understands IP addresses that are known to be bad, IP addresses that are known to be spoofed, IP addresses that are commonly used to attack folks. So we leverage that in our case to map out the riskiness. Of course, you don't always know exactly where that IP address is located, but you can indicate that this is a potentially risky IP address because it's used in other attack vectors.
All right, I'm going to take another one. What type of software do you need to deploy to capture the behavioral biometric attributes to the end users? Are they privacy and consent concerns with this approach? How pervasive are these attributes being used today?
Yeah, so another great question. So there are specialist products that just do behavioral biometrics, right? So there's vendors that specialize in behavioral biometrics. Back to my point about, rich set of context, behavioral biometrics by themselves are really interesting, but we feel they need to be put into context of other risk factors. You can take a simple example of, let's say I broke my arm, falling off a ladder, and I've been doing business with a bank for years and years. I'm probably not going to be moving my mouse and typing the same way that I normally do when I go to interact with that bank. And, behavioral biometrics by itself would flag, my activity as risky and it'd probably be a false positive. So, what we've done is we provide our behavioral biometrics capabilities as part of our fraud engine that have all those other contexts. And we feel that it's a better approach to put individual factors into context. When it comes to GDPR, CCPA, other privacy regulations, IBM's very thoughtful about that in terms of what information gets exposed, what PII is held, and ensuring that we can give the information to our clients through our SaaS solution to show them the information that we've indicated that there's a high risk around without exposing PI or making our organizations responsible for managing that PII on an ongoing basis.
All right, Michael, I'm going to give you one more for today. Does IBM deliver risk-based authentication as a SaaS, SaaS, or on-premises?
Oh, that's a good question. So classically, we've taken people's on-premise identity solutions and integrated it with our fraud engine, and that is very useful for leveraging the investment that you already have made in your identity solution. So if you have an identity and access management solution on-prem, we know how to come in, integrate our SaaS solution as the back end, and give you that risk-based authentication capabilities. That's kind of business as usual for us and what we've been doing for a couple of years. What I'm excited about is we've actually taken the fraud SaaS engine and integrated it with our identity SaaS solution under the covers. and we can deliver it all out of the box in that adaptive access I was talking about in the trial, so that the advantage is just it takes all of the integration work out of the project. The capabilities are available out of the box. You can realize them in a week or two and start using it. So the most popular delivery mechanism moving forward will be SaaS, but we can continue to support that hybrid environment where some of it's on SaaS or on-prem.
All right, Michael, thank you again so much for joining us. That was very informative, and we're pretty good on time here. So I went ahead and posted your email address. So if anyone has any follow-up questions or would like more information about IBM services, you can email Michael directly for that information.
All righty, thanks, Nancy.
Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, let's move along to our next speaker. We have Wolfgang Gorlick. He's Advisory CISO of Duo Security. Wolfgang, are you there?
I am. Hello, hello.
Hello. Thanks again for joining us today. All right, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Good deal. Do you need to pass anything to me so that I've got slides?
I think you should.
Aha. I do. Thank you so much. Great. So this talk is Street Cred, the path to passwordless. And I want to start with a little anecdote I recently heard. I figured I'd share it with you guys and kind of set the stage for my thinking about authentication in general and security to the passwords in particular. So recently I heard this story, and what happened was there's a construction team, right? And the foreman wants everyone to wear the security equipment, right? You got to wear the hard hat. You got to have the vest on. You got to do the right things. There's regulations. There's safety concerns. There's every reason under the sun to put on your protective equipment. But of course, no one wants to do it. No one wants to do it. And the foreman goes around. He cites the regulations. He yells at his workers, and they still won't do it. And day after day after day, he goes back and forth and has this conversation. And day after day after day, the people aren't doing the needful, right? They're not taking care of security. And one day, of course, while complaining about this, the foreman has the idea of, hey, wait a minute, why don't I listen? Why don't I do a little bit more of the soft skills? Why don't I have a conversation and figure out what's going on? So he has some conversations. He talks with his people, and he realizes there's some issues. The hard hats aren't necessarily fit right. The regulations aren't necessarily appropriate. And through some conversation and through some people skills, they come to an agreement. They get better equipment, compliance goes up, everything's good. And it is that age-old conversation of thinking about the user. And when I say age-old, I'm not necessarily joking about age-old. This story actually is from the Dale Carnegie book, right? The 1930s. This story goes all the way back to the 1930s. And we've been having this conversation for way too long. Back in the time of Bonnie and Clyde, they were already realizing that, just yelling at people and quoting the policy wasn't getting security compliance. And quick shout out, by the way, we're all at home. We all need some entertainment. Definitely check out The Highwaymen, which is the law enforcement side of Bonnie and Clyde. And think about it while you're watching, too, about the poor guys getting yelled at for not having their hard hats. We know for a long time that we need to engage the user. 30 more years goes by, right? 30 more years from the Highwaymen and Bonnie and Clyde to when computers arrive and we put them in our data centers. They're stylish. They're fire engine red. I'm sure they look exactly like the IBM ads. However, when we start rolling out passwords, we forget to engage the users. And for the next period of time, up until modern times, people struggle mightily to use passwords. This should be a simple thing. It should be a cheap and easy thing, right? Just type in your password. You should be fine. Maybe if there's one. maybe we still only have one computer in one big room. Maybe that would be okay. But of course, as we all know, the reality is much different. Power users typically are accessing thousands and thousands of sites. And users, average users, have 190 different passwords to remember. So 190 different passwords that you need to keep secure, to come up with a good long complexity algorithm, to probably rotate every 45, 90 days, right? It's ridiculous. And what happens? People reuse passwords. People choose simple passwords, so brute forcing becomes an option. Password theft and reuse becomes an option. Breach after breach, as we all know in this audience, breach after breach traces back to passwords. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is I had a good friend of mine recently tell me he does threat intelligence, and he recently pointed out that you can actually use this now as a signal of intelligence. By that I mean there's sites out there that have password dumps. Have I Been Pwned is probably the most well known. You can go to those sites and put in an email address. And if it doesn't pop up, if that user's passwords haven't been leaked, it's probably a bot. It's probably a new account. You can't necessarily trust it. It's weird to think that the likelihood and frequency of password theft has actually been a signal that, yeah, this is probably a real person. Strange world we live in. And on the opposite side, when you start thinking about what goes into maintaining this, very time intensive, very costly to manage passwords, to manage the resets, because people forget, obviously, because it takes time on the help desk, obviously. Now you can do things on this. I was working with one organization that, of course, did a major password reset system, figured it would save them lots of time. And what ended up happening was people were still calling the help desk, still pounding 0 until they got to a person to reset their password. So are there ways to mitigate these costs? Sure, but it's still a complex and thorny issue. Are we winning friends here? Not so much. We've introduced friction. We've introduced cost and time and complexity. And that's really what we need to tackle and find ways to improve upon. And it's pretty common for all of us to have better experiences, right? When you wake up in the morning and you grab your smartphone, or if you're like me and you wake up and you're already holding your smartphone and you've been on Twitter for 20 minutes. By the way, screen time is terrible. It tells me all the time, you've been on Twitter for blah, blah. I'm like, there's no way. I just woke up. Oh, yeah, apparently I was browsing in my sleep. But for the normal people who aren't so addicted to the devices, you wake up, you grab your phone, look at it, swipe it, whatever. You're into your apps, and your apps can go ahead and get into whatever you want using long-lived tokens or using the implicit trust of the device. Great system. However, not the system that we present to our employees, right? They got to log into their desktops, and then they got to log into other apps, and then from those other apps, they can bring up maybe an SSO portal, or maybe they're logging into hundreds of apps on the side individually. It's really a very different experience from the consumer world to the office world, from the consumer experience to what we ask for our users. And then, of course, we walk around as security professionals and yell at them for not wearing their hard hats and yelling at them for typing in easy-to-use passwords. So we need a better experience. Enter this idea of passwordless, and lots of people have talked about it. Gartner has a great quote that we have here on the screen, but it's this rare win where we can make life easier for the users while making it harder on the attackers. And that's one of the things that if you've seen me speak before, I say quite frequently, right? Good security. What does good security do? It gets in the way of the adversary while getting out of the way of the user. Passwordless is a way to do that. Now, there's a couple different components to passwordless. There's some reasons why we haven't had it to date, right? And there's still some reasons why the old school way of doing this can create some concerns. So I remember I was responsible for a data center, and this data center had the latest and greatest security. We had a man trap, we had cameras, we had thick walls. You know the drill. And we even had a cast iron safe, by the way. I would walk people through on the tour, and we'd stop by the safe, and people would rattle the lock. And yeah, this is a very secure building. I'm like, yes, see, it is. What's in the safe? Don't worry about it. It's very secure. But when we went to biometrics, and we put the system in place, In the spring and summer, it worked fine. By the time winter rolled around, it was drier, and you had less humidity. Suddenly, people couldn't log in. So we called the vendor. I'm like, you got to fix this, right? My very secure data center, no one can get into. This is a problem. So they went ahead and fixed it. Well, I realized later what they did was they adjusted down the crossover error rate. So what that meant was it suddenly started accepting a whole bunch of different fingerprints. It suddenly started accepting, for example, gummy bears. So for a period of time, my very expensive data center, I was logging into with a gummy bear, holding it up to the camera and saying, this is a problem. And eventually they asked me to stop doing that. And eventually they fixed the system. So a lot of us have that in our mind, right? I don't know if we can trust biometrics. It could be too easy to bypass. Or I don't know if we can trust biometrics. What about all this risk that we're taking on storing people's facial information or storing people's fingerprints? And so the modern ecosystem, the modern platform is actually pretty exciting to me for this. Why? Because you've got, the ID in your phone. You've got the ability to log in to Windows Hello, for example. And in both of these platforms, one, the sensors are significantly better than we had back when I was running data centers, and no gummy bears. And two, just as exciting, the biometrics never leave the device. So if I get into my phone with my fingerprint, that fingerprint is not exportable and reproducible and everything else. If I log into my Windows computer with my face, no one is sitting there, snapping my face off that camera and sharing it elsewhere, which they shouldn't do anyways. They should just steal it off of, Facebook or Twitter. Probably easy, but you get my point. So we've made some really good advancements in the platform and the hardware, and we've made some really good advancements in the standards. For the longest time, we didn't have good standards to pass this information around. With the FIDO Alliance leading the way, the same alliance that came out with UTF, the Universal Second Token, the Universal Second Factor, there has been significant push towards standardizing how, after you've authenticated your platform, how you're able to pass credentials back and forth. Now, not necessarily a credential user would type in, but a token that can be used for authentication. So that's where the FIDO2 standard or WebAuthn and CTAP comes into play. So now that I log into my device, I can exchange some information with a website or an application to authenticate without me having to actually type in that credential. Those standards, were formally adopted last year, and more organizations have joined since. So Microsoft and Google, of course. Apple was a early contributor, but officially joined the standard this year. So some really good movement on the equipment you need for passwordless, the type of platforms that would allow the passwordless authentication to work, and the fundamental standards behind it. From Duo's perspective, we joined FIDO early on. We were a launch partner with UTF. We were invited as experts to work on the WebAuthn group. If you're interested from a technical perspective to get into WebAuthn, I'd urge you guys to go to webauthn.io and webauthn.guide, which was put out by some of our experts and researchers and scientists. And then we are also early adopters of Touch ID via WebAuthn. So we've been looking forward to this rolling forward for quite a while. Maybe not since the 1930s in Bonnie and Clyde, quite a while, but for quite a while. So let's talk a little bit about the path to passwordless. How are organizations adopting this? How are they moving forward? With any security control, there's always a journey and always a number of steps to take to roll it out. So passwordless as a very simple definition is, look, we've got multiple factors. We know we've got multiple factors. That's the joy of 2FA, and that's the joy of strong authentication. Still, of course, the first factor, the primary factor, is usually that password. So by moving away from that password being the primary factor, we can move into a passwordless world. And then we can look at other things. Is it biometrics, like I mentioned earlier, which is where everyone's mind goes to, right? I just want to look at my computer and it lets me in. Great, awesome, let's do it. Or is it additional factors like the UTF token I mentioned? It could be a push to your phone, which is a very common way, so that you can begin to look at which factors are right for the user experience. You can begin to look at what factors are right given the risk of accessing that application and system. There's a good degree of play that you can have figuring out how to chain and put those factors together. So the first step along that journey is really figuring out, what your use cases are, what the right workflows are. Easiest way to do that, of course, is by streamlining your authentication workflows so that when you go ahead to access an application in the cloud or access an application on-premise, whether it's more modern auth with SAML or OIDC or legacy auth with Radius and LDAP, that there is one path, one portal, one means that the user goes in and logs in. Now, this is not necessarily getting rid of passwords yet, but it does provide a streamlined experience for the user, and it helps us in the security world add some assurance to that and start teasing out which factors are the right ones to go after. From that, we can look at ways to increase the trust of authentication. Lots of different things that we can talk about here, but predominantly, whenever we're going from one standard to another, the first thing people say is, "Hey, how do I have control consistency?" Right? I've got 2 factors over here. Do I still have 2 factors? Does it count as 2 factors if you're using biometric and just a username? There's always going to be those conversations. But also there's going to be the conversations of how do I provide more security, increase trust in this new world. So when we start talking about increasing trust for authentication, what I'm thinking about here is a lot of the concepts that were talked about previously in respect to zero trust. Is this user behaving normally? Are they coming from a location that we expect? Are they coming from a time we expect? All those behavioral sides. What about devices? Are they coming from a device we've seen before? Very difficult for an attacker to steal a credential and steal the user's device and log in from where they normally are at and log in during the time they normally do, right? We're greatly increasing the level of complexity that an attacker would have to do to carry off a successful attack. So are they on a device that we know, a device that we've seen before, that we manage, or that we trust? Is that device itself in a good state? Is it healthy? Does it meet security standards? Is it showing any signs of infection? Those are the types of things that we'd want to look at in terms of increasing trust for authentication. So when we start looking to the next steps, right now we've got an idea of what our use cases are. We've got an idea of how we can increase trust on those use cases. We've consolidated a bit, and then we can look at how we can pull out those use cases and provide that passwordless experience. There's a couple different ways to accomplish that. One is to the devices themselves. Windows Hello being a good example there. Touch ID being another example. And Touch ID in and of itself is a really good example of what happens when user experience is taken into account. So I don't know if you guys have heard this story or have seen the statistic, but before the iPhone Touch ID came out, people locking their phone was very low, right? Near single digits, in the teens. And that meant that there was a good deal of risk that someone could pick up a phone and view things or take advantage of it. Now, as a security person doing BYOD and doing whatnot, I was very concerned about this. I mean, wait a minute, in the old world, I can push down a policy and force a password. But lots of people were like, no, that not having a PIN is one of my advantages. And as a matter of fact, there's a Steve Jobs rant. There's always a Steve Jobs rant, but there is a Steve Jobs rant about why would you ever lock your phone? Who would do this? We want usability. So the designers, the researchers at Apple looked at it. How do people use their phone? They pick it up, hit the home button, and go. All right, so pick it up, hit the home button, and go. How do we then add in a login experience? Well, if you pick up and hit the home button, if that is your Touch ID, and it goes and logs you in, users are already doing that. It's already the way they act. No additional things needed, low friction, and then add a smart default to enroll people in time. Simple as that. And within about a year, the numbers had jumped over 80% in terms of people locking their phone. It's the power of going to the folks and saying, hey, does the hard hat fit? How are you actually working with this control? So we can start down that journey of including passwordless. And then in terms of passwordless to the various websites, we can look at providing that through SAML via single sign-on. We can look at providing that through a federation service, or we can look at providing that through the FIDO2 standard via WebAuthn to log into those cloud apps. Now, the long tail here, of course, is going to be that legacy technology, things in Radius, things in LDAP, those things are not running the modern authentication. So here what we're looking at is how do we enable them through smart gateways, smart proxies to authenticate the same way so that from a user perspective, same experience, hit the home button, I go. Once we start peeling out those use cases, moving people into those platforms, right? So I can now log into this set of apps via passwordless, and I can now log into those set of devices. As we move forward, the next step is sort of optimizing that. If you think about the CMM flow, right, where you're doing a maturity model, by the time you get to level 5, what are you doing? You're optimizing. So as more and more use cases move in, the importance is optimizing that passwordless tool set. And how do you do that? It is with providing a console for risk-based decisions, providing a console for adaptive access policies, providing that management pane, which makes it so much easier to provide that end user experience. So in sum, as you think about the passwordless, first thing is putting in place strong factors and identifying those passwordless use cases, streamlining those authentication workflows so that for that particular use case, there's a consistent workflow, a consistent authentication path that we can go ahead and lock in. Then we can go ahead and increase the trust for those authentications. That's things like good behavior analytics, good device health, good adaptive access policies. That allows us to provide that passwordless experience to the users for that particular group of folks, for that particular group of use cases, rinse and repeat as we go ahead and move more and more things off of this authentication factor that we've used for 60 years into a more modern method and bring it into an optimized console for management, for oversight. So Duo's perspective on this has been leading the way with good usability for multi-factor, leading the way with good usability for single sign-on, and working with the standards bodies for things such as the FIDO2 standard, so that as we continue to progress into this passwordless future, that we're doing so in a way that is industry standard, that is easy to use, and that does definitely put that customer first. With the, obviously end goal of connecting anyone from any user on their device to every application with the most secure and most easy to use experience possible. So I ended this thought, passwordless is this rare security solution that's both more secure and more easy to use. And what this means in the context of zero trust, what this means in the context of these types of trends towards, more control around access, is that we can then go to users and say, look, we're not going to remove all trust from you, though that may be on the back end what we're doing. We're not going to make your lives harder. We're going to go with you, and we're going to find ways to make your lives easier, make the controls easier to use. And oh, by the way, in doing that, that allows us to provide a more secure experience in the back end. It allows us to move those workflows, those use cases into a zero trust model. I will pause now and open it up for questions.
All right, thank you for that. Let me just go to the Q&A box. All right, it is easy to rotate a password. It is nearly impossible to rotate a biometric like my face. Aren't we giving up flexibility if we move to passwordless?
Right? Because for the longest time, that's what we had to do. We had to say, oh, my passwords have been stolen, let's rotate it. You know, passwords are being guessed. Let's put in place longer passwords that cause people to have to remember more things. That's a really good question. And I think one of the intriguing aspects about passwordless is that increasing trust component. So the concept of stronger protections around the biometric in the devices prevents those from likely being stolen or reused. The controls around the hardware itself, anti-fraud in your cameras, better granularity on your fingerprints, prevents the spoofing aspects. And I'm sure there'll be a cat and mouse game in that regard. There always is. And then the trust signals, the behavior, the device, all that context that we have, all those things we've been building up in the zero trust space for quite a while now, allows us to have a real strong assurance that, hey, that person really is who they say they are. And with that, hopefully, that means I don't have to change my face.
All right, so what about regulations which ask for multi-factor authentication like PSD2 and privacy regulations like GDPR? How does passwordless work in a highly regulated world?
Yeah, and that's why the work with the standards bodies is so important, because good controls that start with the standards bodies end up being part of the security standards that the regulations then get driven from. So there is some work to be done there, as with any control. Early days, the auditors don't quite get it. I remember when I first moved to cloud, they just couldn't wrap their head around the fact that I didn't have an inventory that I was checking every day. I mean, like, but things change all the time. Yeah, but where's your inventory? So part of it is going to be educating the market through working with standards. Part of it is going to be relying upon existing controls to demonstrate compliance. Because we're not getting rid of anything by moving to this authentication factor. And then finally, the third part, the longer tail, is going to be those regulations actually catching up with the passwordless world.
All right, I have one that looks like it affects a lot of us these days with our quarantine haircuts and so forth. What happens when you have a beard and you shave it?
Did you just call me out about my haircut? Man, ouch. Ouch. No, there is going to be, when you have a beard and you shave it, there is going to be some retraining involved if you do change your biometrics. The other one that tends to happen is what happens if you're wearing gloves and it's cold out, right? There's a number of different scenarios where a biometric can get tripped up. So one of the importance about the passwordless model and the passwordless infrastructure you need to rely on is it needs to be able to accept multiple factors. So if it doesn't recognize me today, maybe I send that to my security token or do a push to my phone that allows me to accept, and then I can go ahead and enroll my face beardless or what have you.
I was actually thinking I need to redo my phone so that it recognizes me with my mask on, because a lot of times I'm walking on the street, I'm like, oh, I have to keep unlocking it. And
yes, absolutely.
All right, last one for you. What are some of the first use cases for passwordless? And are there any use cases or types of employees that passwordless wouldn't work for?
So the predominant use cases we see moving first is frequently accessed websites. So the web application world is one that is pretty important. You're going in and out all the time. There's a lot of time lost in those credentials, as well as a lot of those web apps, of course, are now, due to the nature of our world, the gateway into secure information and mission critical data. So that use case is one of the most important ones, I believe, to get right. which is why the work that I mentioned earlier on the FIDO Alliance with WebAuthn and CTAP is so critical. In terms of things that are hard, the logging into your device, easy if it's your device, not so easy if it's in a call center, for example, where you got multiple people running in and running out. So back to the biometrics conversation, what happens if you got 6 people who are sharing a piece of equipment? And another one that's not so easy is some of that legacy systems. Things are still using Radius and LDAP. Those things today are also not so easy. So that's the area where we're running into friction. The area that tends to move fast and move first is in the web sphere.
All right, Wolfgang, thank you so much for joining us today. I went ahead and posted your email address, so if anyone else has any further questions or comments that they'd like to contact you directly, they can go ahead and do so. There's still quite a few questions in the chat that you can, of course, answer privately while you're still on with us. And that's it, yeah, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you so much.
All right, next we're going to move along to our final speaker. We have Michael Lettman. He's the cybersecurity. Starting our virtual cybersecurity summits on July 28th for the Florida region. And for these events, you can earn up to 6 CPE credits. And you can find those dates on our website, cybersummitusa.com. I'll go ahead and post that into the chat shortly. If you are seeking new career opportunities in cybersecurity, we do have a job fair that's virtual. It's going to be held next week on July 23rd. You can RSVP on our other website, techexpousa.com. I'll go ahead and post that in the chat as well. And again, thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you again at one of our upcoming events. In the meantime, please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
We created IoT Nation to help professionals like you navigate the IoT space, to find the companies, people, use cases, and events that are most relevant for you. On IoT Nation, you can browse over 25,000 IoT-related companies and dive into the details for specific ones. You can also search geographically, zoom into any area of the map, and explore companies in any city. You can find applications in various verticals, such as smart buildings, smart cities, connected mobility, and many more. And you can plan your week and month ahead by searching dozens of online and offline events to find the ones that are most relevant for you. For all Cyber Summit Power Hour attendees, we are offering free use of IoT Nation Pro for 30 days with the code CYBER2020V. If you have any questions, contact us at info@iotnation.com.